All right, welcome everybody to this week's class. We're going to be looking at the scriptures this week. And primarily, this is going to be divided into two parts. So the first lecture will be on kind of just how eco-hermeneutics has developed, how people over the last about 50, 60 years or so have been starting to read the scriptures in a way towards environmental concerns. And then we'll take a little bit of a break. I'll end the video and then I'll start another video, and that one will be looking at the laments, the lament psalms, and we'll finish that off with a bit of a discussion about your lament assignments. All right. So just as a little bit of a ground clearing exercise to make sure we're on the same page, I wanted to define what I mean by hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is one of these fancy words that really we could just say interpretation. It's the science of interpretation. Now, depending on what kind of church background you've had, you might have heard this word used in slightly different ways. One way that kind of more evangelical Christians tend to use this word is it's specifically applied to interpreting the Bible, that hermeneutics is about interpreting the Bible. And definitely the development of the discipline arises out of folks that were thinking about interpreting the scriptures. But it's not limited to that. Hermeneutics is about the interpretation of texts, and there's a deep philosophical discourse that goes with this, in addition to it being a more kind of applied practical science in terms of studying the Bible. The root of the word hermeneutics comes from the Greek god Hermes. I've got a little picture of the golden boy there for those of you from Winnipeg. The golden boy, of course, is on top of our legislative buildings and is well, we refer to him as the golden boy. He's very much kind of made in the image of this Greek god Hermes, who is the patron saint or the patron god of trade and travelers, but also is his role among the pantheon is to be the messenger of the gods, bringing messages between different gods and also between the gods on Mount Olympus and we mere mortals below. There is something, if you're starting to think, this sounds very much like our discussion of angels from a few weeks ago. Yes, the figure of Hermes in some ways shapes how Christians have thought about angels and their mediating role. But lest we get too far down that rabbit hole, let's just refocus and say that the reason why Hermes has become associated with hermeneutics is because of this metaphor of the one who kind of mediates between worlds, aiding in the interpretation between these worlds. And so I think one of the ways that we can think about the task of interpretation, particularly the interpretation of texts, is that we are mediating between different worlds. We've got the world of the text, the world that produced the text, our world now, and we have to somehow, as it were, travel between these places and learn how to kind of like experience them, bring them into conversation with each other without allowing one world to kind of overdetermine any of the others. All right. A little crash course on the history of eco-hermeneutics. Ernst Conradi characterizes the development of eco-hermeneutics in biblical studies as being shaped by two factors. First, it was largely a reaction to the claims of Lynn White Jr. in The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Of course, Lynn White famously claims, he reads the Genesis story and says, Christianity is overdetermined by this creation story that sets up humans as those that have dominion and subjugation over all other creatures. And this has made Christianity a fundamentally anti-ecological religion. And so if we need a culprit, if we need somebody to blame for our crisis, this is where we go. Now, there's lots and lots and lots of ways to push back on this. Perhaps the most obvious being, is the creation story actually the most formative, determinative text in the Christian tradition? Is that the place that we actually spend the bulk of our time reflecting on as a religion? And secondarily, is it the most significant place that Christians have gone to for thinking through their relationship with the natural world? I don't think so. I mean, in some cases, in some times, and in some places, sure, it pops up. And I think particularly in the 20th century, on the other side of Darwin and these kind of debates, very silly debates in the early 20th century between kind of like these neo creationists and these young Earth creationists and the kind of the evolutionary creationists and the atheistic evolutionary folks, and all these kinds of very, very modern debates have kind of trapped discussions around creation and the doctrine of creation into this preoccupation with the Genesis stories. But when you look historically, you look through our prayers, you look through our various like doctrinal expressions of how we relate to the natural world, Genesis is not necessarily the most prominent place that people go to, right? Like the Psalms, actually quite a bit of the book of Job is much more often cited as places that people go to think about God's relationship to the created order. God being the one who establishes Leviathan and Behemoth, and or builds his temple upon the waters. Like these other acts of creation, these mighty acts of creation that go beyond our comprehension. These are the things that are often pointed to throughout the tradition as being quite significant in how we think about God's relationship to the created order and our place within it, importantly. So it's just not really the case, I think, historically, until maybe the last 100 years or so, that Genesis looms super large. And so I think rightly people have pushed back on Lynn White's characterization, but perhaps unfortunately, the fact that they're pushing back against his characterization means that in some ways Lynn White is still kind of setting the agenda for how, at least for quite a few decades, people were thinking about the task of creating an eco-hermeneutic. It was essentially an apologetic move against those who wanted to say that Christianity was anti-ecological. So then this apologetic move has two punches, right? First, you say, no, Lynn White's wrong. Here's the evidence for that. And then the second move is to turn to some of these places, some of these other places that you wanted to resituate the conversation at. So perhaps in the book of Job or a particular psalm, and you would then begin to draw out ecological wisdom. And this might take the form of, well, we've missed this all along, but look at what this text says. And the text really has always meant X. There's a problem with that strategy too, because of course, these interpreters are coming as highly motivated interpreters, who are now able to kind of, by some sleight of hand, push aside whatever kind of problematic history of interpretation might have been attached to these texts and say, well, everybody else has been wrong until now. And now what we really know, that what it really means is X, Y, and Z. And isn't that great? And any attempt to kind of say, well, I'm sorry, but here are 15 people who say the complete opposite of you, will be met with a kind of, well, they were just making a mistake. And perhaps that's satisfying to you. for me, it raises a question of how do we take responsibility for the errant interpretations that our tradition has unleashed on the world and has stood behind as Christian orthodoxy. I think that's a bit more intractable of a problem, and one that perhaps biblical scholars aren't actually best equipped to deal with. Is something that the theologians need to do in terms of taking responsibility for our errant children, if you will. But enough of that. Back to our timeline. 1967, Lynn White Jr. He sets the tone with his essay that we've talked about in many other lectures already. The next kind of like major kind of landmark volume, I think, that really starts to kind of shape how we do this work is this book called The Land by Walter Brueggemann. And in this book, so Brueggemann, one of the things that he's famous for as a biblical scholar is paying really close attention to the multivocal nature of Scripture. So he's kind of coming out of a tradition of biblical interpretation that's really interested in, textual criticism or historical criticism. So questions of different layers of redaction, right? So at one point in time, the text was written, you had these kind of oral traditions, and then things were added to it. And so the point of biblical studies in a good chunk of the 20th century was to kind of do these historical reconstructions and say, okay, so here you have this core prophetic utterance of a text. This is what the prophet really said. But then that utterance is kind of placed inside a narrative context by some later community, arranged in a certain kind of order, redacted by different communities, reflecting different changing political commitments over time. And then at some point, this process comes to an end, and then you'll have some sort of debate about when exactly that happens, and that's the quote-unquote final form of the text. Now, as interesting as that work might be, it is a bit useless in terms of actually kind of getting to the question of, okay, well, what do we do with this final form of the text? Like, what is the message here? And so one of the strategies that Brueggemann kind of starts to use is to kind of take a bit of a more narrative approach, but instead of kind of like spending too much time trying to do reconstructions of like various redactic layers, he'll kind of note them, but then say, well, these represent different disagreeing voices in the text. And actually, the genius of Hebrew scripture, he wants to argue, is that this disagreement is not submerged, right? Like the final editor doesn't come along and present us with this neat final story that is just completely cleaned up and has no trace of disagreement in it. In fact, however it was that the Israelite people thought about their scriptures and the development of their scriptures left room for disagreement and argumentation all through the text. And so you have this really neat ability then to kind of situate yourself within the arguments and disagreements that make up the text and start to plot out what are the different interest groups here? What are the different ways that they're making sense of how God has acted in their midst? And so Brueggemann takes this basic idea and he applies it to the question of the land. And he says, well, actually, if you pay attention, the land is a major character in the Hebrew Bible all throughout. And the land has voice, and the land acts in different kinds of ways. The land is one of the covenant partners, right? There's a triadic relationship between people, God, and the land. And the land is a kind of a personal agent in much the same way that God and the people are in that relationship. And that if we pay attention to the Hebrew Bible, you start to see that popping out all over the place. So I think this book, even as old as it is, I think it's still very much worth reading. It's still kind of a landmark in biblical studies around these questions, and really, I don't know if it's really been surpassed. There's been people who've taken up these various strands and done really interesting stuff with it, but I would still highly recommend it. The next kind of move here was by an Australian fellow named Norm Hobble. He wrote this really interesting book called The Land Is Mine: 6 Biblical Land Ideologies. And so he extends Brueggemann's kind of like ideological criticism method, but he kind of contradicts Brueggemann in an important way by pointing out that there isn't actually that the land actually and views about the land are plural in the scriptures as well. So there isn't like a biblical land theology. There are, for him, at least 6, and they range everywhere from kind of like a very kind of monarchic dominational approach to the land to something much more kind of like ecological and liberative, and the land being a personal actor and all this kind of stuff. And there's a bunch of different relationships in between that mediate the relationship between God, people, and land in all sorts of ways. And that's really interesting because I think this book is super important to bring some realism back to folks, like I was mentioning off the top, the kind of biblical scholar who wants to say, well, what the text really is. And once you understand the biblical way of understanding the land, or something like that, well, this book stands there as kind of a correction on that, to say, well, no, there actually just are, this is just an ambiguous thing in the Bible, and there are disagreements about this, and some of them are things that we don't necessarily want to bring forward. Right? Like, some of them are uncomfortable. Some of them are anti-ecological, actually. And so those bits of the Christian tradition that have been picking up on that, they're not wrong. They're not like going against the Bible. They're picking up on one set of trajectories that are available in the text, and we're now wanting to pick up on a different set of trajectories. And that's a harder thing to deal with, I think, than just simply being like, well, my interpretation of the Bible is right and everybody else's before me was wrong. Norm went beyond just this book. About a decade later, he established something called the Earth Bible Project series. And this was a very fruitful little project for a time that created a bunch of commentaries and on kind of reading the Bible through a kind of an environmental lens. And importantly, they developed a certain hermeneutic of suspicion, a way of, like, a kind of a formal method for doing this that they kind of agreed to as a group, as a kind of a set of guiding principles that all the people who contributed to this project were going to use. I will. All right, so the Earth Bible Project was shaped first by a hermeneutic of suspicion. And the hermeneutic of suspicion comes from feminist interpretation of Scripture. So in the feminist interpretation of Scripture, the fundamental problem with the Bible is that it is a patriarchal text. And that, remember we talked about the kind of the layers of redactional criticism? Well, according to the kind of the feminist interpretation, the final form of the text is produced in a highly patriarchal society. And so patriarchy obscures and twists perhaps some older traditions within Scripture that are thought to be more egalitarian. And so what you need to do to read the Bible as Scripture for today is to kind of come at it with this lens of suspicion, that's saying that this patriarchy is something that's getting in the way of the message of the text, and we need to kind of scrutinize the ways in which female characters are marginalized, submerged, or have in other ways had their voices taken away. Now, when the Earth Bible Project is going, they say, well, this problem of patriarchy actually, it's also an anthropocentric problem, right? By placing the male human person at the center of the drama of Scripture, um, you run into this problem where, like, not just women's voices are submerged, not just women's characters are expunged, but also all non-human creatures, right? The voice of the land is harder to hear. The voice of the animals and the plants and the trees and the mountains and waters. These are all harder to hear when you have the kind of the male anthropos at the center of it all. And so they extend this feminist critique and say, okay, we need to be on the lookout for the ways in which all of God's creation is being kind of like subordinated under just this image of of male actors and a male God. And so, following from that, they derive 6 principles, which you can read here on the slide. I'll upload the slides as well on the website. I won't bother reading them for you all here. But they kind of, I've also linked on the slide itself to the essay. So if you want a little bit more description of exactly how it works, you can find that there. I'll just note that there's a real strong, so this is like constructing a set of rules and a kind of an intentional lens to read all these texts from. And I think it's not wholly, like, the worry might be for some Christians that this is imposing a kind of a foreign lens onto the text, and so is also doing the kind of distorting work that they're accusing kind of patriarchy having done to the composition of the text. And there's always that worry. However, I think some of this stuff, at least, does actually kind of arise out of a kind of a close reading of the text itself. That and Norm kind of shows this a little bit in the essay, if you want to kind of skim through that. Like, if you are just a close and attentive reading of Scripture, you will see that at least some of this stuff, particularly, I would say, number 3, the principle of voice. Earth is a living entity capable of voicing its cries against injustice. That's a principle that I think is like very firmly, very like evident in Scripture. If you just pay attention, the earth is crying out all the time, and the earth is acting in relationship to the injustices that are done on it or to it. And so I don't think all of this is just simply kind of like the zeitgeist of the time that Norm and his crew are kind of applying to the Bible, but rather they're seeing something in Scripture and they're saying, hey, let's like formalize this a little bit, and then let's like, having received something out of the Scriptures, let's like turn that into a lens that we then put back onto the Scriptures and see how it might clarify some things. And so you begin to see how, like, hermeneutics, the process of hermeneutics, is a bit of a cyclical thing, right? We read the text raises questions and gives us kind of insights that we then take and apply back to the text again, and just see how that fruitful process might open up new meaning for us. All right, there's been an explosion of developments since, and I won't bother covering them all. Just naming a few significant ones here. Terence Fretheim, you've got a whole kind of group of quote unquote process-inspired eco-hermeneutics. These are folks that push back against what they identify as classical theism, the idea of a God who is characterized by the various classical attributes of God, so omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and divine aseity, or like simple substance, as in God is consistent. They want to say that no, God is deeply relational and bound up in the created world in all sorts of like really intimate ways. And look, when we when we read the biblical text, we see that God in various ways has a body, and God has emotions, and God changes God's mind, and all this kind of stuff. Now, some of this work has the tone of a gotcha on the theologians, and again, it kind of reflects the way in which biblical scholars and theologians don't really talk to each other, tragically, because theologians have ways of dealing with all those texts. It's not as if the classical doctrines were created by people who didn't read the Bible. It's just that sometimes they're, perhaps asking questions at different points in church history that are not the same questions we have now. And so coming back to these through the kind of the lens of the questions that evolutionary biology raises for us, and the question that the climate crisis raises for us. These prompt us to go back to the biblical text and take a new look at the data and ask, are the ways that we explained away some of the stuff that we see about God in the scriptures actually still adequate, or does it need to be changed? And I'll let you make up your own mind about that, but I'm happy to have a conversation about that on specific texts if you'd like. You also see the development of a few different kind of schools. A very prominent one, and one that's on my mind given the fact that I am recording this from a hotel in Carleton Place, just outside of Ottawa, where I will be attending a conference with Norm Wurzba this weekend. The New Agrarians. So Wendell Berry is kind of a big inspiration to these folks. Wendell Berry, of course, one of the great American agrarian writers, but also calling on the church to kind of embrace various agrarian principles in thinking about our relationship to God and one another. And at Duke University, both Ellen F. Davis and Norm Wurzba have really championed this way of reading scripture, and have spent a lot of time rereading the scriptures, thinking about what would it mean. We know that the Israelites were an agrarian society, right? Like agriculture and subsistence agriculture was fundamental to who they were. And what do we know about agrarian peoples now, and how can that help us kind of understand some of the concerns and some of the ways that they're relating to the land and the animals thereupon? What are the limits and possibilities that opens up? Indigenous folks often do have a similar kind of reading strategy where they will. I've heard many Indigenous clergy and elders kind of say like, oh, the Israelites were an indigenous people, and therefore they had these kind of indigenous relationships to the land. Now, both these claims are true in a certain kind of sense, but I think one way that we should be a little bit hesitant is to kind of assume that that there's a direct parallel between agrarians around the world today and the specific kind of cultural makeup of the Israeli people. Like, we cannot kind of go and do ethnography among the Israelites, the ancient Israelites. And so we're always kind of working with a certain set of reconstructions. And some of these lenses, whether, to read the Israelites as a kind of indigenous people, or in a kind of agrarian people, or any other kind of people, they're helpful insofar as they go. But we should remember that they are kind of like lenses that can open up meaning for us, but can also be possibly taken too far. And that takes just some discernment and wisdom on our part as interpreters. More recently, and I've included here on the slide a picture of a very recent book that just came out this past year, of various ways that now, as eco-theology has given way to kind of religion and ecology kinds of conversations, the the ways that people are now kind of approaching the question of eco-hermeneutics is a little bit different than in the past. They're borrowing quite heavily from various other developments, interdisciplinary developments in kind of the environmental humanities more broadly. And so they would borrow things like kinship and affect studies, particularly around the field of animal studies, to kind of bring that into looking at the relationship between Israeli people and their animals in different kinds of ways. And that has opened up all sorts of really interesting possibilities in the text. You've got kind of borrowing from recent breakthroughs in the ecological sciences, this idea of rhizomatic or mycelial structures. So the rhizome is kind of the network of roots under prairie grasses, and how they represent kind of like non-hierarchical sets of relations that are interconnected in all sorts of different ways, and that these roots, they don't just kind of come from a central place and like go down like that, but in fact end up weaving together and connecting and creating pathways between them that don't necessarily follow a hierarchical logic. And mycelial, as in like from like mushrooms and fungi and stuff like that, they also have similar kinds of structures. And so seeing these structures in the natural world of non-hierarchical ways of relating, and kind of applying that to the text to see, well, what would it look like if we don't assume a hierarchical, if we were to, when I was in seminary, we were taught that the ancient Near Eastern covenants that we have are reminiscent of these suzerain vassal treaties that we see throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, where essentially a conqueror comes in and conquers a people and then sets himself up as the suzerain, the overlord, and the conquered people as the vassal state that has to pay tribute. And that this structure of legal agreement that we see examples of from the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Assyrians, this is the kind of thing that's in the background of the Israelite covenants between Israel and God. That God is this ultimate suzerain, and the Israelites are his vassal. And so that inscribes hierarchy directly into the nature of the relationship between God and God's people. But what would it mean to look at that from a more like some other non-hierarchical set of relations? Is that possible? Does that do damage to the text, or does it actually open up one of the ways that perhaps the Israelite conception of law and treaty and covenant is different than our kind of like our assumptions about it have been? So all sorts of questions that are raised here. There's a collection of theories kind of bundled under the title of New Materialist Ontologies. These are things like object-oriented ontologies, actor network theory, that was Bruno Latour's big idea, and the new animism, which we talked about, or we read about this week, and I'll talk about on the next slide. Folks are drawing insights from human geography, critical geographies. This is a discipline that studies not just kind of so you got like natural geography or physical geography, which is like kind of the study of like resources and physical places and stuff like that. But then human geography or critical geography starts to look at like the sets of relationships that make up places, and the movements of people and their relationship to the natural resources and all of this kind of stuff. And so bringing insights from that, I mean, this for me has been very fruitful as a strategy for reading the text. I often, if I'm stuck for sermon prep, I'll ask myself, okay, what are the place names here in this little bit of, particularly if you're preaching from the Old Testament lection. If you start to ask, okay, where is this happening? What are the place names being invoked? And what do those place names mean in Hebrew? Because sometimes one of the kind of cheeky things about Hebrew narrative is that if names are given for things, sometimes that indicates that that name is a bit of a character in the story. And so always pay attention to given names, because they'll sometimes give you a clue as to what the story's about or where the action is happening. And that can be a really like interesting way of like opening up another dynamic on your reading of the text. And of course, various like post and decolonial discourses. So particularly attentive to the way that the threat of empire is always kind of lurking there for Israel, but also a temptation to make nice with empire, right? And also to enact its own kind of imperial and colonial strategies upon the inhabitants of the land. And you can see various spots in the narrative where indigenous peoples to the land, or the Israelites in relationship to their imperial overlords, make various kinds of resistances, and do so in conjunction with the land itself. And when you start to pay attention to that, that can really open up a lot of really cool thinking for us today about the relationship between imperial and colonial power and the violence it inflicts upon both people, but also all the creatures in a given place and the land itself. And that the cry, the cries that we heard last week from each of you around places that you've seen despoiled, of lakes poisoned and dead from algal blooms, of forests that are clear cut. These aren't disconnected from the kind of extractive colonial imperialism that structures our world, and lending our voices to the cry of these hurt places can be an incredible resistance strategy. And I think we do see that in the scriptures as well. All right. Marie Jorstad, so you read a portion of her text, of her book this week. Really fascinating book. Highly would recommend. I want to try and get her out to Winnipeg at some point, because she's just such an interesting thinker, and she's currently working at Vancouver School of Theology, which is an Anglican United and Presbyterian seminary out in Vancouver. So she makes a distinction in her kind of advocacy of using the new animism as a lens for reading the text. She makes a distinction between kind of animism, which was an old category kind of created by anthropologists and scholars of religion, that often had kind of a derogatory implication that there are peoples who, they don't even have gods. They don't even have a recognizable pantheon or deity. Instead, they just worship rocks or ancestor spirits or something like that. And this was considered kind of like lower down on the developmental link of civilization, right? That on the one end, if you found a civilization that practiced like monotheism, they were much more advanced civilizationally, was the assumption, than those who were worshiping tree spirits. And so animism was kind of created as a almost a weaponized category, to basically be quite dismissive of a lot of various indigenous approaches to religion all over the world. And so kind of similar to like what we saw when we talked about Bruno Latour and this idea that in modernity you create these purified concepts and then weaponize them against the pre-modern civilizations, right? And so this is kind of one of these categories that gets like weaponized to be very dismissive, and then also very flattening and lacking in any kind of nuance in the study of these kind of animistic things. So it doesn't really name anything specific. Animism is a bit of an umbrella category, and it can be structured very different in all sorts of different cultures. So like depending on so depending on the indigenous culture, for example, there might be different rules that their language or their practices have in terms of like who gets to be a person, right? So in one culture, you might name water and trees and like water and plants and animals as persons, but not maybe rocks and fish. Whereas others might make a distinction between kind of all kind of like quote unquote natural things, things that haven't been subjected to kind of like any human technology or technological change. These things are persons, but human-made objects are not persons. Whereas some would say, well, okay, that's generally true, but actually sacred objects, those things, so like a peace pipe or something like that, those things might be persons. So it can really range in terms of like the particular nation that you're studying and the particular makeup of how they like conceptualize these things. So animism studies has kind of changed, and now we talk about the new animism, and this is less a kind of an emphasis on the spiritual reality that underlies it, but rather an attempt to try and name descriptively the sets of practices and commitments that go on within societies structured by animism. So they tend to really emphasize two things: that that there are persons that are more than human, right? So not just humans or persons, and that the world is structured by a kind of a fundamental interconnectedness. Those two basic things tend to structure the new animism. And that's slightly different than other kinds of new materialist ontologies, which might want to assent to the idea that there are agents or actors that are more than human, but won't necessarily grant them personhood. I think the new animism tends to emphasize the personhood aspect of more than human agents. So for Jorstad, this this theoretical development in kind of anthropology and the study of religion is useful to apply to the biblical text because it can help us. We assume when we like come to the Bible that what we're confronted with is monotheistic religion. And so when we come with that assumption, then it's easy to miss stuff that doesn't fit into our preconceived notion of what a monotheistic religion is and how it works. And so, for quite some time, biblical scholars have tried to push back on the idea that Israelite religion is monotheistic by saying, no, it's henotheistic. Henotheism being this idea that you affirm like a top god, but you also affirm the reality of other kinds of gods. It's just that your God, the one that you worship, is the one true God, and all the others are somehow lesser or don't have any power in comparison to your true God. But even that, Jorstad would say, it still would perhaps lead us to miss some of the connections that people since the 70s, as we've seen in previous slides here, have been noticing about like the way that the land and these more than human creatures, they seem to have some sort of a personal existence in the text at times, and have some sort of importance in the relationship between God and God's people. And so how do we like take that seriously? Well, if we like come at it through this lens of the new animism and try to like describe the actual patterns of behavior and things that we see in the text, maybe this allows us to kind of better appreciate some of that stuff and to not just immediately write it off as metaphor, as just creative license on the part of the authors, but as something that they're trying to point us to as like, actually, this is like really real to them in an important way. And I'll say, even if it is metaphor, what else is a metaphor except an intensification of language that points to what we want to communicate as really real, right? A metaphor is a creative use of language that picks out something and is kind of non-reducible in its explanatory power. So Stanley Cavell talks about this sentence in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is the sun, and he tries to kind of say, he tries to give an explanation of what Juliet is the sun means when Romeo says it, and he goes on and on and on about all the possible things that it could mean. And he eventually just ends with "and etc." because you can just keep going on, and you still wouldn't capture the fullness of meaning that is captured in this simple little phrase, Juliet is the sun. And so a metaphor is kind of like super condensed with meaning and points to something that's really real and kind of forces us, because it plays with like incommensurability, right? How can Juliet be a flaming ball of gas in the sky, right? Like the is relationship there is not one of like simple identity. There's something kind of like weird going on, and so it makes us pay attention. And I think when we come across metaphorical language in the Bible, and particularly around these kind of like ecological things, it's important to not just say, oh, that's mere metaphor, because mere metaphor doesn't really exist. That's not what metaphors do for us. Metaphors point to something very strange about the world and open up a kind of a whole new world of meaning if we let it. They're not a kind of a lowly linguistic device. They're a very important linguistic device that gives color and texture and depth to the universe that we inhabit. All right, there's just we got a little bit of time here to go through a few biblical examples of places that the kind of animistic features that Jorstad points to could be seen and thought about. And I would love to hear from some of you. Perhaps next week we can hear from each other some of the biblical examples that come to mind for you. But you see in Genesis chapter 3, the serpent is talking to Adam and Eve, and like Christians sometimes are like, oh, that's the devil, and like, well, that is the tradition of interpretation, but also like it's pretty clear, no, it's a serpent. It's just this snake, and it's doing this, it's having this really weird interaction with Adam and Eve. And what's going on with that? Like, typically you don't have serpents engaging you in conversation and trying to lead you astray. And it's importantly kind of not identified with the enemy or the devil. It's just identified as just one of the creatures in creation. And so that can lead you to kind of thinking about like all these trickster traditions in other kind of like indigenous animistic traditions of like, there's often a trickster animal that interacts with the human character in all sorts of devious and interesting ways. And so how would it look if we read the serpent in the garden as some sort of a trickster character, and that he's doing something different than just simply kind of like trying to set up an enmity between God and the humans. Genesis 4, the land is doing some interesting stuff. It swallows the blood of Abel. It will no longer accept the work or the seed of Cain, and in fact, it cries out against him. So there's a fair bit of agency on the part of the land that it's quite sensitively attuned to the violence that has happened upon it, and it will not be fruitful for the one who has done violence upon it. And this motif, I think, is actually picked up again and again in the scriptures. Actually, the land itself can be polluted by blood and can be polluted by violence, and when it does, and injustice, and when it is, it will turn on you. the land will turn on you and will devour you. You see this in uh, the Exodus with the slaughter of the babies in the Nile River. When Pharaoh kind of orders all the slaughter of the babies and the Nile runs red with blood, and then when Israel is escaping from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians step foot in the waters to pursue them, and the waters kind of take their vengeance upon those that have kind of polluted their waters with blood, right? You have the earth crying out in vengeance. You have repeatedly the prophets saying that because of the injustice of the Israelites in the land of promise, that the land is going to spit them out, and ultimately does, right? They are spit out into exile, and it's said that the land does this to them. In Numbers 22, famously, we have the talking donkey, Balaam's donkey, seeing something about the way reality really is in terms of the angel of the Lord who's set there in the path of Balaam, and Balaam's donkey kind of preserving his life. This donkey is picked up again in one of the Gnostic texts, the Acts of Thomas. So this is a kind of a late, I think, 2nd or 3rd century text that was kind of a Christian text that was kind of like floated around with the other New Testament texts that eventually became canonical, and this one did not for various reasons. But there's a really interesting story in there where this donkey that Thomas is riding around introduces himself and says, hey, I'm actually of the line of Balaam, and also in my lineage is the donkey, the colt that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. And so there's this continuity of this line of donkeys that has somehow had this ancient relationship with Israel and with the kind of the work that God has been doing through Israel. And so you see it through the perspective of this. So the donkey gives this whole speech back to Thomas about things that God is doing, and it's kind of set because, well, these donkeys have been there and they've been watching and they've been passing on these stories. Isaiah 55, you get the singing and dancing mountains and the clapping trees. Like, that's beautiful. Also, that would be terrifying. What kind of upheaval must that be for the mountains to sing and dance and for the trees to clap? That is a world-shaking event. What are some of your favorites? I'd love to know. You can either shoot me an email this week or we can talk about it next week. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a break here and I'm going to start a new video.